On the 30th of January 1649, the King of England and Ireland, Charles I, was led out onto the execution scaffold on Whitehall in London, and he passed through the window of the Banqueting House. He was the king who had lost the English Civil War, and was placed on trial and then condemned to death, with his death warrant being signed by a number of men known as the regicides. Even Oliver Cromwell, the king's nemesis, signed his death warrant. The man who would take the life of the king is not entirely known till this day, as the executioner performing the job, made a quick getaway to avoid being identified. But the axeman took the head clean off the king in one swift blow, and following this, his head, along with his body, were placed in a coffin ready to be embalmed. The head of Charles I was allegedly sewn back onto his body, but then centuries later, the coffin of the executed king was opened, and what those people discovered was shocking with regards to his head, as it had fallen off of his body. King Charles I walked under armed guard to the Palace of Whitehall the day before his execution, and outside here his execution scaffold had been created. On the scaffold he made a speech to the crowd, and many people were undecided about whether this was something which was necessary. There was a fear in England by parliamentarians that if Charles I was in exile, then he would come back to the nation to invade with a foreign army, but because of this the decision was made to execute him. Whilst on the scaffold he claimed that an unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. He also stated, "But I must tell you that their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government. That is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be." At 2 p.m. the king placed his head on the block of the scaffold after saying a quick prayer, and he then told the executioner that he would signal that he was ready to die by stretching out his arms. The executioner had tucked his hair into a nightcap so it would not trouble him. But the executioner, when instructed by the king, thrust down his axe onto the king's neck, and his head was taken off in one swift and clean strike from the axe. The executioner did not show the king's head to the crowd out of respect, and also out of fear of being identified by his voice. He would usually have claimed that, "Behold the head of a traitor," but this wasn't done. Many people rushed to the scaffold and dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood from the scaffold, and then the executioner made a hasty getaway. Following the execution, the king's remains were placed into a coffin which was on the scaffold, and this included his corpse and his head. The coffin was taken back into the Banqueting House and the Palace of Whitehall, and they were then taken into a room where the remains were then embalmed. During this process, a number of his internal organs may have been removed, and these probably were, as was usual during the embalming of kings and queens, and these organs were placed into separate containers to be buried elsewhere. But during this, the king's head was sewn back onto his body, and the doctor who did this used a thin thread to reunite the body with the head, and it was then placed inside of a lead coffin. For some time there was a debate as to what to do with the body of King Charles I, and Parliament then settled on burying him inside of Windsor Castle, in the chapel, St. George's, and specifically inside of the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. This decision was made as it was considered a quiet place where his body would not be dug up and then venerated as a martyr, and there was a fear that the king's remains would be exhumed and then worshipped by pro-royalist forces. On the 9th of February 1649, the king's remains were taken to St. George's Chapel, and he was buried in secret under the cover of nightfall, and for many centuries many believed that his grave had been lost, and no one really knew where the body and the head of King Charles I were. but little did people know that he was buried at the heart of the Order of the Garter's chapel, in a small vault in the choir of the chapel in Windsor Castle, interred next to England's most notorious king, Henry VIII, and buried in adjacent vaults to the kings of the Wars of the Roses. It was in 1813 that there was building work occupying the inside of the choir and the chapel, and with this an opening was made with regards to the vault where the body had been placed inside of. Discovered inside of this vault were 4 coffins, one belonging to Henry VIII, which was huge, another belonging to Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, whose coffin was in a good state, a small coffin belonging to a child of Queen Anne, and also the large coffin of Charles I. But to bed rumours about Charles I's remains being elsewhere, the decision was made to open the coffin of the executed king on the 1st of April 1813. Watching this was the Prince Regent, the future George IV, and it was Sir Henry Halford who was the man who examined the body of King Charles I. They broke into the coffin, and what they found was incredible. Halford discovered that the head of Charles I had fallen off of his body, and that the thread had disintegrated in the years following his execution. When the pall was removed, a plain lead coffin with no appearance of being enclosed in wood was found, and it had the inscription King Charles, 1649. It was said that a small opening was then made in the top part of the coffin lid, and inside the internal wooden coffin it had decayed a lot, but the body of King Charles I had been heavily wrapped in a number of layers of cerecloth, thick wax-coated cloth that was wrapped over the body to preserve it. But the coffin was full, and the cerecloth caused a number of problems with the body, and it became difficult for Halford to unwrap. But Halford even made a sketch of Charles's hand, and then described what he saw. He wrote, "At length the whole face was disengaged from its covering. The complexion of the skin of it was dark and discoloured. The forehead and temples had lost little or nothing of their muscular substance. The cartilage of the nose was gone, but the left eye in the first moments of exposure was open and full, though it vanished almost immediately, and the pointed beard, so characteristic of the period of the reign of King Charles, was perfect. The shape of the face was long oval. Many of the teeth remained, and the left ear, in consequence of the interposition of the unctuous matter between it and the cerecloth, was found entire. It was difficult at this moment to withhold a declaration that, notwithstanding its disfigurement, the countenance did bear a strong resemblance to the coins, the bust, and especially to the pictures of King Charles I by Van Dyck, by which it had been made familiar to us. It is true that the minds of the spectators of this interesting sight were well prepared to receive this impression, but it's also certain that such a facility of belief had been occasioned by the simplicity and truth of Mr. Herbert's narrative, every part of which had been confirmed by the investigation so far as it had advanced, and it will not be denied that the shape of the face, the forehead and eye, and the beard are the most important features by which resemblance is determined. When the head had been entirely disengaged from the attachment which confined it, it was found to be loose and without any difficulty, was taken up and held to view. It was quite wet and gave a greenish-red tinge to paper and linen when touched. The back part of the scalp was entirely perfect, and had a remarkably fresh appearance, the pores of the skin being more distinct, as they usually are when soaked in moisture, and the tendons and ligaments of the neck were considerable substance and firmness. The hair was thick at the back part of the head, and, in appearance, nearly black. A portion of it, which had since been cleaned and dried, is of a beautiful dark brown colour. That of the beard was a redder brown. On the back part of the head it was more than 1 inch in length, and had probably been cut so short for the convenience of the executioner, or perhaps by the piety of friends soon after death, in order to furnish memorials of the unhappy king. When the head was held up, it was said that the muscles of the neck had evidently retracted themselves considerably, and the 4th cervical vertebrae was found to be cut through its substance transversely, leaving the surface of the divided portions perfectly smooth, and even an appearance which could have been produced by a heavy blow inflicted with a very sharp instrument. Henry Halford's work inside the royal vaults with regards to Charles I confirmed a number of things. Firstly, that he had been executed using a sharp weapon, such as an axe, and that this had been performed in one blow, with the executioner being rather skilled. It was claimed that, following this examination of the head, which served every purpose in view, and without examining the body below the neck, it was immediately restored to its situation. The coffin was soldered up again and the vault closed. The head of Charles I had fallen off from his body due to the fact the thread had perished in the centuries, keeping it attached to its body. The head of King Charles I in Halford's sketch shows that 2 centuries after his execution, his hair had been preserved, as had his beard, and his eyes were also clasped shut, but his nose had decayed. The execution of King Charles I is still controversial to this day, but the opening of his coffin also caused a stir, as some believed that it was in poor taste, but it did confirm the fate of the executed king. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.